This is going to be my second attempt at this video because it chucked me out the first one. That's really useful, isn't it? Oh well, hopefully it'll be even better this time. Waiting for the beep. There we go. Okay, good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to this just small, short, I hope, revision video on writing great A-level introductions. And it's about a specific structure that I've come across in my researches over the holiday, partly in thanks, well, very much in thanks to Funky Pedagogy, fantastic English teacher who has lots of ideas of how to make English literature in particular more visual in its style. And I think that's something that I'm seeking in my teaching and something that could give you a bit of a different perspective. And I think it's this way of framing introductions is really useful. Caveats as usual, I would much prefer to be able to do this live model so I can talk you through my thought process as I go. But I'm going to do that to the largest extent I can with basically when I did this, I did it on paper originally. I tried to do it as authentically as possible. I've taken pictures of it and I've put it on the PowerPoint for you. So I've tried to make it authentic. So hopefully you'll find it useful. Right, let's get on with it. Oh, wrong button. I love technology. Here we go. So really simple 3-step method of introductions for A-level essays. I'm talking specifically about B and C because there's a bit of a quirk to section A when you've got your extract in aspects of tragedy. Things are slightly different because, of course, you've got to think much more, you're going to be much more focused on the extract and putting the extract in the context of the play as a whole, etc. I've already put plenty of stuff up on that on Classroom, so please delve into that. And so today I'm going to focus on section B and C, particularly C, actually, because I think that's something that some students can find tricky. We've talked about it a fair bit, but this is the example I'm going to use is a section C. So, introductions. Discuss, define, refine. Really nice, DDR, simple term to remember. What does that actually mean? One, the easiest bit, show that you understand or you've got awareness that these are the key terms you need to focus on. These are the key themes that it is steering you towards. You may have heard me say this before, but I think of the question as a steer. In other words, think about it. If you're given a specific question that asks about fate and free will, and it asks you to talk about the role of the protagonists in that, and you focus, for instance, your essay entirely on the antagonist. That's a bit being like given a direction, ignoring it and crashing into the wall in front of you. You do not want to do that, funny enough. I don't want anybody to be crashing into any metaphorical walls. So if you're given a steer, if it says go right, do it this way, actually follow that and focus on what they're doing. Obviously, we're going to talk about how important it is for you to interpret it. You can be quite creative in your interpretation, but do not ignore the question. Do not simply download everything you know onto the question, because that is not going to work. The examiner hates it. They really want to see that you've thought, you've used your brain. It's not that you've, yes, to an extent, we can do loads of practice questions, very useful, but they try deliberately to come up with unusual questions because they want you to have an active process of thinking and reaching in your brain and thinking about, okay, here are all the things I can pull down that are relevant to that particular question. And here is how I'm going to curate them, bring them all together to make a great final product that has a real clear response to the essay that I'd been asked for. So just think about that, not downloading, curating, steering in the right direction as in accordance with what they've asked for. So in this first part, it might be as simple as rewording or reframing the question, just rewriting it in that sort of more traditional type way. Fine. You might want to acknowledge some relevant context. Again, not downloading everything you know, but if it's relevant to understanding the question, we're going to look at a question about protagonists' fates and whether they're sealed from the outset. You might set that in its historical context briefly to show that you understand that it depends what text we're talking about as to whether this is true or not. Briefly, though. All right. Getting much deeper. Second D, our define, is really important. This is all about acknowledging the fact that words clearly have lots of different interpretations. You might look at a couple of different ones, but then steer us very clearly towards your favored interpretation. Because, as long as you've not tried to say that, I can't think of an example of something that's impossible, you know, that you've decided to make a thing about, you know, you've defined fate as oranges, then that's a problem, clearly. But if you clearly made an effort to explain what fate is and you've then stood by that definition in your essay, then you're home and clear. So that's great. Right, so you've got your favorite interpretations. And then most importantly, our refined section. This is all about what are your overall views? What are your arguments, particularly in relation to the specific text that you are looking at in order to create that sense of debate? You really helped in this question, and that 99% of the time they give a statement and they say to what extent you agree. So you've got to come up with an argument, probably a nuanced argument, taking into account different elements of that question. But that is really important, that this last bit, taking the specifics of what you are looking at, makes an argument that's going to underpin your entire essay. A well done introduction is, you know, such an incredibly important thing. It sets all the right tones for the examiner thinking, okay, right, I'm comfortable now. I'm sat down, I'm in my seat. I know this person knows what they're talking about. They've shown me it from the outset. They've signposted to me what they're going to be talking about. Now I'm relaxed and ready to actually enjoy the rest of this essay. That's how we want our examiners to feel and our readers to feel in general. It's just nice. Okay, so let us move on to our next slide. So in terms of laying out this style of introduction, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. You can do it in the boring kind of just, you know, D arrow, R arrow. That's absolutely fine. If that's what you want, no problem at all. Okay. And obviously it's notes only because you're trying to do this. This took me about, I don't know, 3 minutes. You can see I've made the odd bit of a mistake as I've been writing it down for you, because I've tried to do it kind of authentically as possible. But I've tried to keep it incredibly simple, but useful, so that it's something that I can look at. All right. So this part, this planning of the introduction, can be just as important a planning as the whole thing, because as I say, it underpins the essay as a whole. Couple of other things to think about. Really important is, this is a tragedy essay we're focusing on here. Clearly, the same would be true if we were talking about political and social protest. You'd be focusing on all of the themes that are relevant there. But we want to, you know, I'm not in any way saying you need to use fancy Greek terms for tragedy, because we've talked about many times before that actually the examiners are not a big fan of that, of trying to throw in big words like anagnoresis and all this kind of stuff. They have no interest in that. They want to show that you've thought about things and you've engaged with them. So you want to be talking about tragic ideas, tragic themes, etc. Okay. So in other words, downfall, fate, reversal of fortune, free will, blindness and perception, all of these different things, you know, anything, chaos and disorder, disruption of natural order, hamasha, of course, how can I, you know, hubris, all of these things, fantastic. If you're engaging with them and you're exploring them, catharsis and so on, in your essay, then you're not going to be going far wrong, whether it be section A, section B or section C. It's really, you know, this is the aspects of tragedy. We're going through the lens of tragedy. So always have that in the forefront of your mind. Even if ostensibly it seems to be a question about character, it's still a question about tragedy. So just bear that in mind. That's just a really simple but important thing. Then we've got our visual version up the top here. I just like the symbolicness of this, really. It starts really simple. It's got an outline of the question. You don't need to write the whole question down, but you really want, you know, the keywords there. I've decided to reframe the question of the role of fate being historically vitally important. Clearly, when I write the actual thing, I might go into a bit more detail on that. Define, yes, okay, I'm thinking important. Fate is important, but if I'm defining, which clearly I am, you know, in this, fate as being predestination, in other words, that everything is set in stone already in that kind of Calvinistic, I want to say, sort of sense, then no, I'm saying that doesn't seem right. That can't be that no one chooses the path they goes down at all. There has to be a role for free will. There needs to be an element of choice, and therefore there's a sense that, you know, if we talk about fate in this way, there's a sense that actually no, protagonist fates are not sealed from the outset. But of course, I'm starting to get into my thesis, but that really comes to head finally in the refined section where I'm looking specifically at my text. So my claim here is, again, note form, personal decisions, the banishment, the confiscation, the crime, the adultery, they are vitally important in the case of Richard and Gatsby in the downfall of those characters. They are all individual decisions they make that lead to their downfall or doom. Therefore, that's what the 3 dots is, in case you don't know. It's not true to say that fate is set in stone, particularly if you're looking at Shakespeare and Fitzgerald, as you are going to. There seems to be a role for responsibility too. All right, so that is, in a nutshell, my thesis. Why the arrow? Because it's all about, the tip of the arrowhead is always, the most powerful and important point. So you're building throughout your introduction to the tip of this arrowhead, to this vital point. Now, you might decide that, gosh, I am not going to faff around in an exam creating these visual plans, but it still might be something useful that you might do as part of your revision, just to build that in your head, to get that idea that there's almost a crescendo effect coming in your introduction, that some of the earlier stuff is more about just putting things into context, defining things, but then you're building towards your key thesis. So I just like that idea of building up towards the most important thesis point. Right, so that's really useful, hopefully. So can we flick ourselves on? Yes, we can. So this is on the basis of that, I then wrote this introduction. Please take your time. What I'd say is a really productive thing you can do with this is to take it away, have a read through it, label it. Where do you think my DDR comes out? But what do you think it does well? Could it do anything better? Because as I say, this is something that I did, I don't know, honestly don't know, about 4 minutes maybe. I don't know. I scribbled it down. That's on 2 different pages. That's why it looks rather untidy. So this did not take a vast amount of time. But think about, what does it do well? Does it address all the different AOs? Does it make a clear argument? Does it give a sense of debate? Does it define the terms clearly? Does it link into any tragic terms or tragic themes? Does it link into any context? Let me pull out a couple of little things. I'm not going to read the whole thing out for you because I think you can do that independently. Note, when I've done my little historical overview, I've said only rarely in Roman times, for instance, do characters' actions and outcomes seem predestined. I think we've talked about this in class, probably quite some time ago, to be fair. But we talked about that there's a bit of a transition between possibly the Greek perceptions of tragedy and the Romans, where they tend to have kind of slightly gory revenge fests where it almost seems like it didn't matter what the character ever did in the first place, that they were going to come to a sticky end anyway. So it's a bit of an aberration in that sense. But we've definitely talked much more frequently about the fact that Shakespeare's, partly what makes Shakespeare's plays interesting, is that he doesn't predetermine his characters and make it clear that the gods will interfere and ruin his life, whatever the characters do. He wants them to be instrumental in their own downfall. Macbeth is obviously the obvious case of this. He's clearly a big part in his own destruction. He doesn't have to listen to Lady Macbeth. He doesn't have to listen to the witches, but there's this kind of inherent ambition and bloodlust that leads him to make decisions that means he's doomed. Same with Lear, really, isn't it? His vanity, his naivety, his hubris, all of these things. If he's really, the one thing you could say that makes it unfair for him is he has no control over his senility. He's 80 years old. What could he really have done? That is, we get the impression, the fact that Kent and so on are still following him, if the fool is still following, Cordelia loves him for all this time, suggests he has been a good king. So you could say there's a sense that Shakespeare slightly loaded the dice unfairly in the case of King Lear, because he can't, if he's got dementia or whatever it might be, or coming insanity, he can't do much about that. However, clearly he makes very active decisions that lead to his downfall. The love trial, who shall we say loves us most? How could that ever end well? Because it's just valuing the wrong thing. It's a play about value and his inability to see what has true value until it's too late, and until he's stripped himself naked on the heath and finally realizing he's taken too little care of this. So that's key there. I think Gloucester's a difficult one because clearly, his naivety and his hubris are a big problem in his downfall. I've realised I've gone totally off topic here, but well, it's not off topic, it's on topic, but it's, you know, off these two off these two texts that I'm supposed to be focusing on. But hey, hopefully it's still useful. I've lost my place now. Oh yeah, so Gloucester, obviously his original decision to sleep with a woman out of wedlock against the law of God, is instrumental in his downfall. So he does make that decision, and he also very clearly makes the decision to instantly mistrust his son. Like most people would take a beat, one would hope, before they immediately just decide their son is a traitor, and maybe might think more about the motivations of their other son, who is, you know, he's literally called in Act 1 scene, you know, the whoreson must be acknowledged. Anybody with any brain could see that might be a little bit irritating for the person that's legally called a bastard and has less rights and has less, you know, is being sent away to be educated and so on. But Gloucester likely utterly lacks the foresight that he needs, and the decisions he makes as a result lead to his downfall. So again, I think it's very untrue to say Gloucester's fate is sealed from the beginning. He makes a series of personal decisions that are not helped by, you know, having an incredibly clever Machiavellian son who knows how to manipulate him. But you cannot absolve Gloucester from responsibility and say simply, you know, it was the gods, it was the cogs of the universe, he couldn't have done anything about it. Back to what we are actually focusing on, thank goodness for that. Richard, now he's an absolutely textbook example. He's a terrible king who's made terrible decisions that lead to his ignominious death. I think that one is probably, out of all the texts that we study, the clearest one, where his hamartia is just, it makes it clear that he is going to have a terrible, awful death. And it's not a sudden chance deus ex machina of gods intervening and just making sure everything's miserable. It's Richard himself. He makes the decision to make the confiscation of the land that would rightfully go to Bolingbroke. It's him that banishes Bolingbroke, who it seems like possibly did nothing wrong. Because remember, in the whole Mowbray encounter at the beginning, he knows that Mowbray has murdered the Duke of Gloucester. But there's that whole subterfuge. And we know that Richard hired Mowbray to kill the Duke of Gloucester. But on the face of it, Richard needs to be seen to dole out some kind of justice, but he doesn't want to actually have a fight to the death. So he banishes Bolingbroke, who then comes back to be his greatest enemy. So that wasn't great, was it? So clearly his decision, you know, yes, it's partly about what kind of a character Bolingbroke is. You can say that he has some inherent ambitions and so on, and that those are partly what lead him to come back, and maybe the others would just take their banishment tail between their legs and disappear. But for the decisions of Richard, I mean, particularly the confiscation is worse. To take a man's rightful inheritance, to take all of those goods, to strip everything. John of Gaunt, who's incredibly, you know, he's a national treasure. He's a really, you know, one of the most important, well-known figures of that time. To think that it was going to be acceptable to strip his land and all of his goods and just use them to pay for the Irish wars, and there would be no repercussions. Again, incredibly, you know, lacking in foresight, and therefore it's only ever going to end in tears. So I think, again, I'm really fighting back against that. The idea of protagonist fates being sealed, and the same with Gatsby. Ultimately, yes, fine, he has grand ambitions. He wants to win back the love of this woman. It's lovely and idealistic. It's a beautiful idea in principle, but let's look at the realities, as Tom does. You know, he's engaged in bootlegging. He's engaged in a criminal life, in the criminal underground, in order to get the money that he needs to impress Daisy. And ultimately, his goal is to lure a wife away from her lawful husband. Neither of these seem like very sensible things that are likely to have happy consequences. Now, of course, in this case, the thing that he could not control was being killed by Wilson, which obviously was instigated by Tom. You could say that there's a large extent to which Gatsby couldn't have foreseen that. But however, you know, he provokes Tom. You can see he's a dangerous man. He's portrayed as a dangerous man, you know, the way he just casually hits his mistress and so on. And he's described as being a brute. We know he's capable of violence and revenge and so on. And you can say the way that he flagrantly tells Tom to his face that, you know, your wife's leaving you, is never going to go down well, and there are going to be repercussions. Could he have foreseen, though, that actually that was going to be his death at the hands of Wilson? You know, even though he wasn't actually driving the car. I think that one, I would say, it does feel a little bit like fate has just worked against him. So you could, you know, have that as a kind of mitigating factor in your thesis. So ultimately, really, as I kind of hinted in the plan version, if we're evaluating Shakespeare and Fitzgerald, it would be silly to say that they think protagonists are simply predetermined roles. They're just set off on a little, you know, trap that they can't possibly escape. They're not in a little maze where they can only go certain ways. They make personal choices for which they have to take personal responsibility, and therefore, to a large extent, it is not true. The statement we're given at the start is not true. That is my approach to it. Of course, you may completely disagree. If you've got, you know, if you think when you gather in your head your evidence and ideas that you've got a much stronger sort of sense that actually it's a myth, you know, it's a kind of illusion, the sense of choice, and actually society determines exactly, you know, take the more Marxist approach of society kind of predetermines what choices are available to us. So in fact, you don't have free choice of event. Fine, do that. That's absolutely brilliant. Fantastic. You know, there's nothing to say. I'm not saying this is the right answer. I just wanted to elucidate for you how I put together this answer in terms of discuss, define, refine. So you can go away. Please do go away and do some practice examples of this. Please do send them to me. That would be absolutely fabulous. You know, again, as I say, you can try it particularly for section B section B and C style essays, both on this paper and political and social protest. I think it's just as useful there too. So make, you know, have a think about how you can do that. And I think that's probably it from me. I still owe you, and I will try and get it online for you because I keep forgetting to finish it and take a picture, a brain dump of I've done essentially a tragedy brain dump focused on the text of King Lear to give you an example of what I talked about in my previous video, but I haven't posted an A-level specific version online, but I will get to that very soon. Yeah, I think that's it. If you have any questions, please do email. I haven't actually put the slide on here, unhelpful, but email jsummers@jhgs.bucks.sch.uk with any questions you have. If you want to forward me any examples or ideas or suggestions, I will try very hard to get some more things back to you as soon as humanly possible. Yeah, thank you very much. Have a lovely day, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.